There is only one known recording of Adolf Hitler speaking in a calm, unguarded voice, not addressing a crowd, not performing before cameras, not delivering a speech crafted for propaganda, but speaking conversationally, almost reflectively. That recording was made in Finland. On June 4, 1942, Adolf Hitler traveled north to a quiet railway siding near the town of Immola in southeastern Finland. Officially, the visit was presented as a gesture of respect, a birthday greeting to Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim on his 75th birthday. Publicly, it appeared ceremonial. In reality, it was strategic. By the summer of 1942, Germany was deeply engaged in a war against the Soviet Union that had already exceeded its original expectations. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had begun with rapid advances across vast territories, but the Soviet Union had not collapsed. Moscow still stood. Leningrad remained under siege, but unconquered. The Red Army, battered yet unbroken, continued to mobilize men and industry on a scale that forced German planners to reconsider their assumptions. Finland, meanwhile, occupied a position of quiet but considerable importance in this wider struggle. After the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, in which Finland had resisted Soviet invasion at enormous cost, the country had entered what it called the Continuation War alongside Germany in June 1941. The decision had not been ideological. It had been driven by geography, security, and the desire to regain territories lost under the harsh terms of the Moscow Peace Treaty. By late 1941, Finnish forces had retaken much of Karelia and established defensible positions beyond the pre-Winter War borders in certain sectors. They stood north of Leningrad, tying down Soviet divisions and contributing indirectly to the German encirclement of the city. Yet the Finnish leadership remained cautious. Their objectives were limited, and those limits were deliberate. Mannerheim, who had served in the Imperial Russian Army before Finland's independence and had commanded Finnish forces during the Winter War, understood the dangers of great power conflict. He recognized that cooperation with Germany was a matter of necessity, not destiny. Finland had not signed the Tripartite Pact. It had not transformed itself into a national socialist state. Its parliament continued to function. Its military remained under Finnish command. This distinction mattered. As the war in the East dragged into a second year, German expectations increased. There were hopes in Berlin that Finland would participate more directly in decisive operations against Leningrad. There were assumptions that shared enemies would naturally produce shared long-term aims. But Helsinki was careful not to bind itself beyond what it considered essential for national security. By early 1942, the tone of the war had changed. German offensives continued, yet the initial certainty of swift victory had faded. The scale of Soviet industrial production, much of it relocated east of the Ural Mountains, surprised even seasoned observers. Casualties mounted, supply lines stretched across immense distances. The Eastern Front was becoming a war of attrition. In that context, Finland's cooperation was not a minor detail. Its northern front fixed Soviet forces in place. Its territory provided strategic depth. Its stance carried symbolic weight in Europe. A small nation that had resisted the Soviet Union once before now stood again in opposition. Hitler chose to reinforce this relationship personally. The decision to travel was significant in itself. By 1942, Hitler rarely left German-controlled territory, and security concerns limited his movements. That he would fly to Finland underscored the importance Berlin attached to maintaining Finnish alignment. Yet the manner in which the visit was arranged revealed something equally important. The meeting was not held in Helsinki's presidential palace. There was no grand procession through the capital, no mass rally staged for spectacle. Instead, the encounter took place at a railway siding near Immola, where Mannerheim's train had been positioned to serve as a reception venue. The setting was controlled, modest, almost understated. Symbolism matters in diplomacy. Hitler came to Finland. Mannerheim did not go to Berlin. When the German aircraft landed on June 4, 1942, the reception was formal and carefully managed. Photographs show polite expressions and measured gestures rather than exuberant displays of solidarity. There were speeches, toasts, and ceremonial exchanges appropriate to a birthday commemoration. The surface presentation was cordial. Beneath it lay calculation on both sides. During the official proceedings, recording equipment was set up to capture the formal statements. The Finnish sound engineer, Thor Darman, placed microphones to document the speeches. When the prepared remarks concluded, the equipment continued recording as Hitler began speaking informally with Mannerheim and President Ryti. What survives from that conversation is remarkable not because of dramatic revelation, but because of tone. Hitler's voice, absent the theatrical intensity of his public addresses, sounds controlled and reflective. He discusses the campaign against the Soviet Union, the scale of Soviet armament, the unexpected number of tanks encountered, and the industrial capacity that Germany had underestimated. It is the only known recording of him speaking in such a manner. The conversation does not contain sweeping declarations. It does not produce a new alliance. It does not announce expanded commitments. Instead, it reveals a moment in which the war's complexity intruded upon earlier assumptions. The true significance of the meeting, however, lies less in what was said than in what was not agreed. Finland did not pledge unconditional support for expanded German objectives. It did not commit to the destruction of Leningrad as a joint ideological campaign. It maintained its existing position, cooperative yet bounded. Mannerheim understood that alliances in wartime can shift, but geography remains constant. Finland shared a long border with the Soviet Union, and whatever the outcome of Germany's campaign, Finland would continue to exist beside that reality. Survival required not only courage in battle, but restraint in diplomacy. On that quiet railway siding in June 1942, the balance between cooperation and independence was carefully preserved. The visit concluded without dramatic gestures or sweeping commitments. Yet in its caution, it defined the relationship. Hitler had come seeking reassurance. Finland offered partnership, but on its own terms. The limits that Finland set in 1941 and 1942 were not accidental. They were the result of internal debate, historical memory, and a sober reading of geography. Inside Helsinki, the leadership understood that the war against the Soviet Union could not be viewed in isolation. However intense the fighting, however deep the resentment left by the Winter War, Finland's future would ultimately be shaped by its ability to coexist with its eastern neighbor. A total identification with Germany would transform a limited war into something far more dangerous. The question of Leningrad became a quiet but decisive line. German forces encircled the city from the south and west, while Finnish troops held positions north of Lake Ladoga. A coordinated assault might have tightened the siege further. From Berlin's perspective, complete cooperation would have strengthened the campaign. From Helsinki's perspective, direct participation in the destruction of a historic Russian city carried consequences that would long outlive the war itself. Mannerheim chose not to cross that threshold. He framed Finland's objectives as defensive and territorial rather than ideological. The aim was to secure borders and protect the state, not to wage a war of annihilation. That distinction was communicated diplomatically but firmly. Finnish forces would maintain their positions. They would not advance solely to satisfy German strategic ambition. This stance required balance. Germany remained Finland's primary source of military support. Supplies of fuel, weapons, and grain moved northward through channels that could not easily be replaced. German troops operated in northern Finland, particularly in Lapland, where joint operations targeted Soviet positions near Murmansk. Dependence created vulnerability. At the same time, the Finnish public was not uniformly enthusiastic about deepening ties with Berlin. The memory of independence, declared in 1917 amid the collapse of the Russian Empire, remained central to national identity. The civil war that followed had been brutal and divisive, but it had also reinforced the fragility of sovereignty. Many in Finland viewed the war against the Soviet Union as a continuation of unfinished defense, not as a crusade aligned with National Socialism. The leadership had to navigate external expectations and internal realities simultaneously. By mid-1942, the broader war was entering a new phase. German forces launched a major offensive toward the Caucasus and the Volga River, seeking oil fields and strategic cities. The scale of the campaign reflected both ambition and urgency. Resources were stretched thin across immense distances. The Eastern Front consumed manpower at a rate that strained even Germany's mobilization capacity. Within that context, Hitler's visit to Finland served multiple purposes. It reassured the Finnish leadership of Germany's commitment. It signaled to domestic and international audiences that the Northern Front remained aligned. It offered an opportunity for personal diplomacy in a war increasingly defined by mechanized slaughter. Yet personal diplomacy cannot erase strategic calculation. The meeting in the railway carriage was courteous, but it did not alter Finland's war aims. There were no secret clauses binding Finland to expanded operations, no formal integration of command structures, no public declaration of unity that erased difference. Finland maintained controlled cooperation. The recording of Hitler's informal conversation reveals not triumph, but strain. He spoke of Soviet armament in numbers that had surprised him. He described encountering more tanks than anticipated. He discussed the resilience of Soviet industry and the difficulty of neutralizing it entirely. These admissions were not dramatic confessions, but they conveyed an awareness that the war was more complex than initial planning had suggested. For Finnish leaders listening, this tone reinforced their caution. If Germany underestimated the Soviet Union once, it might do so again. If the war extended into years rather than months, alliances could become liabilities. Finland's survival would depend not on German victory alone, but on its own flexibility. Throughout 1943, as the German defeat at Stalingrad reshaped the Eastern Front, Finnish policymakers observed carefully. The Red Army regained momentum. German forces were pushed westward. The aura of inevitability surrounding German success began to fade. The strategic question in Helsinki shifted from how to win the war to how to end it. Maintaining cooperation with Germany remained necessary in the short term. Abrupt disengagement risked economic collapse or military retaliation. German troops stationed in northern Finland could not simply be ignored. Supplies continued to flow through German channels. At the same time, quiet exploration of alternatives began. Diplomatic feelers were extended indirectly toward the Soviet Union. Intermediaries carried messages. The possibility of a negotiated settlement was considered, though the terms would undoubtedly be severe. The leadership understood that timing was crucial. Seek peace too early, and Germany might react harshly. Wait too long, and Soviet demands might become harsher still. This delicate balance defined Finnish policy through 1943 and into 1944. The meeting between Hitler and Mannerheim in June 1942, therefore, should not be viewed as an isolated event. It was a moment within a broader strategy. By maintaining visible cooperation while refusing total alignment, Finland preserved room to maneuver when the tide turned. The summer of 1944 would test that strategy under extreme pressure. In June 1944, the balance that Finland had tried to preserve came under direct assault. The Soviet Union launched a massive offensive on the Karelian Isthmus. Artillery barrages of extraordinary intensity preceded armored advances that struck Finnish defensive lines with overwhelming force. Years of preparation and industrial mobilization now translated into concentrated military power. The Red Army that attacked in 1944 was not the same force that had stumbled through the forests in 1939. It was larger, more coordinated, and better equipped. Finnish defenses bent under the pressure. Positions that had held for years were threatened within days. The scale of the attack forced Helsinki to confront the possibility of collapse. Independence, preserved once at terrible cost, was again at risk. Germany offered assistance, but assistance carried expectation. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived in Helsinki with a clear message. Continued German military support would require a political commitment that Finland would not seek a separate peace with the Soviet Union. The demand was framed as necessary for trust between partners in war. President Risto Ryti faced a dilemma. Refusing the request might jeopardize urgently needed aid. Accepting it without condition would bind Finland's future to Germany's fate. The solution was carefully constructed. Ryti provided a personal letter to Adolf Hitler in which he pledged that Finland would not negotiate a separate peace during his presidency. The commitment was not ratified by Parliament. It was not framed as a binding treaty of state. It was personal, limited in scope, and tied to his office. The distinction was deliberate. German deliveries of weapons and aircraft followed. Finnish forces stabilized their lines in a series of defensive battles that halted the Soviet advance. The immediate danger receded, though losses were heavy. In August 1944, Ryti resigned. Mannerheim was elected president shortly afterward. With Ryti's resignation, the personal commitment lapsed. Finland reopened negotiations with the Soviet Union. The armistice signed in September 1944 imposed harsh terms. Territory was ceded again, including parts of Karelia and the Petsamo region. War reparations were mandated, placing heavy economic burdens on a country already strained by years of conflict. German forces stationed in northern Finland were to be expelled, leading to the Lapland War, in which Finnish troops fought former German partners as they retreated and destroyed infrastructure behind them. The transition was abrupt and costly. Yet Finland remained independent. There was no occupation government imposed in Helsinki, no forced incorporation into the Soviet Union. The political system endured, though under constraints shaped by post-war realities. The country entered a period of careful neutrality, balancing relations between East and West in what would later be called a policy of pragmatic coexistence. The events of June 4, 1942, can be understood more clearly in this wider frame. When Hitler came to Finland, he sought confirmation that the Northern Front would remain firmly aligned with German strategy. He encountered cooperation, but not submission. He received respect, but not surrender of autonomy. The meeting produced no irreversible commitments. Mannerheim's conduct that day reflected a broader principle. Finland would fight when necessary. It would coordinate when advantageous. It would accept assistance when required, but it would avoid entanglement that eliminated choice. The informal recording of Hitler's voice, captured inadvertently in a railway carriage, reveals a leader grappling with the scale of a war that had grown beyond initial expectation. It captures realism intruding upon ideology. What it does not capture is any promise that Finland would follow Germany wherever the war might lead. The railway siding at Immola was not a grand stage. There were no massed crowds, no banners, no theatrical displays. The modest setting conveyed something essential. This was not a celebration of ideological unity. It was a meeting between states navigating shared danger. In the years that followed, the wisdom of restraint became evident. As German armies retreated and Soviet forces advanced westward, many nations in Eastern Europe lost sovereignty for decades. Borders were redrawn, governments replaced, political systems transformed by external power. Finland's path was difficult, constrained, and shaped by compromise. But the state endured. The preservation of that endurance did not depend on a single battle or a single speech. It depended on cumulative decisions made under pressure, on recognizing when to cooperate and when to hold back, on distinguishing between temporary necessity and permanent alignment. On June 4, 1942, Adolf Hitler traveled north, expecting to reinforce an alliance. Mannerheim did not challenge him publicly. He did not provoke confrontation. He did something more consequential. He maintained limits. In a war defined by extremes, by total mobilization and total destruction, Finland's survival rested on measured calculation. The country could not overpower its neighbors. It could not dictate the course of global conflict. What it could do was protect its own margin of decision. The meeting at Immola became, in retrospect, a quiet turning point, not because of dramatic declarations, but because of what did not occur. No irreversible pledge, no abandonment of autonomy. Hitler came to Finland as the leader of a vast empire at war. Finland received him as a sovereign state, and when the war ended, that sovereignty remained. The armistice of September 1944 did not bring immediate stability. It marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one fought not in forests or along fortified lines, but in diplomacy, economics, and political survival. The Soviet Union demanded significant reparations, to be paid largely in industrial goods. For a country whose infrastructure had been damaged and whose resources were limited, the burden was immense. Factories that once produced for domestic needs were redirected toward fulfilling reparation quotas. Shipyards expanded, metal industries accelerated, labor was reorganized around obligation. The cost was heavy, yet the requirement had an unintended consequence. The necessity of industrial output pushed Finland to modernize rapidly. New production capacity emerged under pressure. The economy, strained though it was, became more structured and technologically capable in the process. At the same time, the political environment required careful adjustment. The Allied Control Commission, dominated by Soviet representatives, oversaw compliance with the armistice terms. Certain political movements were restricted. Public discourse shifted. Foreign policy narrowed into a disciplined balancing act. Finland could not openly oppose the Soviet Union, nor could it abandon its Western connections entirely. The line between independence and subordination was thin. This period later came to be described as a policy of neutrality shaped by realism. The objective was not ideological alignment, but survival through accommodation. Elections continued. The parliament remained. Presidents were chosen through constitutional mechanisms, but every major decision was weighed against the reaction it might provoke in Moscow. In this sense, the strategy visible at Immola in 1942 extended into peacetime. Cooperate where necessary, maintain limits where possible, avoid irreversible commitments. The Lapland War, fought between Finnish and German forces from late 1944 into 1945, underscored how fluid wartime alignments could be. German troops, retreating northward toward Norway, adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure across Lapland. Finnish forces were compelled to push them out under the terms of the armistice. Former partners became adversaries within months. The transformation was stark. It demonstrated again that Finland's wartime cooperation with Germany had been instrumental, not ideological. Once the strategic calculus changed, so did the alignment. Looking back at June 4, 1942, the meeting between Hitler and Mannerheim appears less like a moment of unity and more like a negotiation conducted in restraint. Hitler arrived at a time when Germany still appeared powerful, when its armies were advancing toward new objectives in the south. Yet even then, Finnish leadership avoided tying national destiny to German victory. The informal recording captures a subtle shift in tone from certainty to complexity. Hitler speaks of production figures, of material realities, of obstacles that did not disappear under force of will. The conversation hints at recognition that the Soviet Union could not be dismissed as easily as early propaganda suggested. For Mannerheim, such admissions reinforced the need for distance. He had witnessed the collapse of empires before. He had served under the Romanovs and seen their authority dissolve. He had led a young republic through civil conflict and foreign invasion. His perspective was not shaped by ideology alone, but by experience. In that railway carriage, the dynamic was not theatrical. There was no raised voice, no overt confrontation. There was something more restrained and perhaps more powerful. Equilibrium. Finland would remain engaged in the war for 2 more years after that meeting. It would face renewed Soviet offensives and internal strain. It would sign difficult agreements and make painful concessions, but it would never become a province of a larger empire. That outcome was not guaranteed. Many nations in Eastern Europe lost their autonomy entirely as the Second World War reshaped the continent. Governments were replaced, political systems transformed, sovereignty became conditional. Finland's path was narrower. It required compromise without capitulation. It required cooperation without absorption. It required recognizing when strength was insufficient and when restraint was the only viable instrument. The visit of Adolf Hitler to Finnish soil stands as a symbol of that balancing act. A dictator at the height of his power traveled north expecting affirmation. He received courtesy and collaboration. He did not receive submission. The distinction was subtle at the time. To fully understand the atmosphere of that meeting, it is necessary to consider the contrast between image and reality. By 1942, Adolf Hitler's public persona had been carefully constructed through spectacle. Mass rallies, banners, orchestrated lighting, and controlled press coverage reinforced an image of inevitability and dominance. His authority was performed as much as it was exercised. Immola offered none of that stagecraft. The railway carriage was confined. The delegation was small. There were no cheering crowds, no choreographed gestures designed for propaganda newsreels. Even the birthday framing could not entirely mask the strategic tension beneath the surface. Mannerheim, for his part, was not a man given to theatrical display. His authority derived from command experience and personal reserve, rather than emotional performance. The meeting therefore unfolded between 2 very different temperaments. One accustomed to commanding vast audiences, the other accustomed to speaking quietly and listening carefully. The informal recording captures this contrast. Hitler's voice, stripped of amplification and rhetoric, becomes almost analytical. He discusses tank production figures, raw material shortages, and the scale of Soviet mobilization in terms that suggest calculation rather than triumph. There is no shouting, no sweeping prophecy of imminent victory. Instead, there is acknowledgement of complexity. For Finnish leaders present, this tone carried meaning. It suggested that the war in the East was not a simple march toward resolution. It reinforced the wisdom of caution. If even Germany's leadership recognized the magnitude of the struggle, Finland could not afford to bind its fate too tightly to outcomes it did not control. The restraint shown that day was therefore not passive. It was active discipline. It required declining deeper commitments without provoking confrontation. It required maintaining cordiality while preserving autonomy. In the months and years that followed, that discipline would prove essential. The Eastern Front would consume entire armies. Alliances would fracture. Certainties would collapse. But the line Finland drew in 1942 remained. History often highlights dramatic turning points, invasions, declarations, treaties signed in ornate halls. Yet sometimes the preservation of independence rests on quieter moments, on choices made in confined spaces, on the refusal to cross lines that cannot be uncrossed. On June 4, 1942, in a railway carriage near Immola, Finland defined the limits of its alignment. Years later, when the war had ended and the map of Europe had been redrawn, those limits helped ensure that Finland remained a sovereign state. Hitler came seeking reassurance in a war that was growing more uncertain. Finland offered cooperation, but it preserved its margin of decision. In that restraint lay the difference between partnership and possession, between alliance and absorption. And when the guns finally fell silent across Europe, Finland still stood on its own soil, governed by its own institutions, navigating a difficult peace, but retaining the authority to shape its own future.